Anyway, tell me if you can. I'm going to talk to you about learning a slightly different problem than you've seen in the first two talks, and maybe when you see the rest of the meeting here, with the exception of the next one. So I'm going to talk to you about learning from pairwise constraints, and my first attempt will be to try to convince you that this, I'll define what it is. You may think you may know what it is. I'll talk a little bit about pairwise constraint and why the problem is interesting. And this describes the work that was done here actually in the last 10 years almost with a number of collaborators. There is Shao, I would say physiologist and psychophysicist, Gil, Dizenstock, who is a psychologist from Bar-Ilan, Frank, all the physiologists, German physiologists, and 4 ICNC students, all graduated, most recently Ruby, who is now at Stanford. So I used to have a picture of them, but there's no room anymore. So what are pairwise constraints? Well, these are pairwise constraints are relation between pairs of data points that tells you whether they originate from the same source or differently. So we'd have positive constraint, meaning the 2 points came from the same source, negative, they came from different sources. And why are we interested in that? Actually, my interest in that got started when I was at Philips many years ago. And this is because, first of all, pairwise constraint is something you can derive from any labeling scenario. If you have 2 labels, you can derive constraint, whether the 2 points have the same label or different label. Can't hear me. Elon, you still, can you hear me now or no? Should I use this? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so pairwise constraint is something you can derive from labels. It's slightly weaker than labels. It's a slightly weaker signal. But the reason we got interested in it, as per se, as equivalent constraint, is that this is something you can derive for free in some scenarios without supervision. And that makes it a little more interesting, especially in the context of, say, cognition, where you might think this is the kind of information that children could derive without the presence of a teacher. Now it completely died. Okay, so stand here. Now you can. You still can hear me, right? You know, I'll try to scream, and when I stop screaming, which will happen, tell me and I'll scream again. So, equivalence constraint is something you can derive from label, is something you can derive for free. For example, in this application, this is a surveillance application. Imagine these are 2 surveillance cameras mounted, say, in Macy's, and they're detecting these intruders who are stealing from the cash registers. So this is the first intruder, terrible Miss Wen, and this clip is taken by the tracking camera. I think that was too loud, right? This is taken by the tracking camera, and what we do know about all the pictures in this thing, since the camera was tracking the intruder, is that all these images are taken from the same individual. So this gives us a free positive equivalence constraint, relations between pairs, in this case images, telling us that they come from the same source, the same intruder. If we are getting 2 clips from 2 cameras taken at the same time, but at different locations, for example these 2 clips, then we can immediately derive the conclusion that these 2 intruders are different people. Okay, so equivalence relations got our attention because this is a source of supervision that you might get for free in some scenarios. Like I said, certainly if you think about a child, this is the kind of information you may think he would have access to. In the categorization scenario, we might think about where we have labels. We might think about this example. You'll see it in our experiments. So here is a creature that we're going to present our subjects. These 2 are from Mars, these 2 are from Venus, and you have labels. From the labels you can derive equivalence relations. So these 2 are the same, these 2 are the same, these 2 are different. One is from Mars, one is from Venus, these 2 are different, and so on. Okay? So this relations is something you can derive from any scenario. Now the first, what I'm trying to would try to bring across right now is that there is a big difference between positive and negative equivalence constraint. So even though I'm using the same colors like Ran was using in his previous talk, for blue for positive and red for negative, they're very different. These are not 0 and 1 labels. These are 0, 1 and -1 relations, and they have different properties because they operate on 2 points. Okay? So they look similar. It almost appears like a binary problem, but it's not. And I try to tell you why. First of all, maybe a little more importantly, what they're good for. So positive relations tell you something about the variability within a class. Now, the general context that I'm talking about is categorization, classification in machine learning and categorization in humans. So this is the problem we're interested in. Positive constraints tell you something about the variability within a class. So, for example, the fact that you know that these 2 data points are from the same category tells you something like, well, the color probably doesn't matter. What really matters is the shape. All the things in that category are circles. Negative constraints tell you something about the boundary between categories. So, for example, this pair will tell you, well, you know, that these 2 guys come from different categories. They have the same color, so color is not the important distinguishing feature between categories. Probably the shape again. Okay? So far they still look the same, but they tell you something different about the space. Second observation, in this example you can already see that there is a lot more negative constraint than positive constraint. So positive constraint, the number of positive constraints is determined by the number of examples in a class. That's all you have in this example, 9. If you had 1 example per category, you would have none. On the other hand, there's a lot more negative constraint between, in this case, you'll see, it's supposed to illustrate a lot of them, altogether 27. Okay, so negative constraints are more abundant, and what I would argue next, that they are less informative. So why are they less informative? Really the analyzing reason is the lack of transitivity. So if I'm telling you that I have 2 positive relations, A is the same as B, B is the same as C. Conclusion is that A is the same as C. We have this transitivity. But with negative constraint, we don't have that. I tell you that I'm different from you, and you're different from him. This doesn't tell us A is different from B, B is different from C. It doesn't tell us anything about the relation between the first and the third. And that would make them much less informative. So all this was hand-waving, and actually we can nail it down with some computational argument. This argument is what we like in computer science, the next slide is what we like in physics. But basically, in computer science, we like to talk about the complexity of learning something. So if we think about the following problem, suppose we have a categorization problem. And let's say each point of our samples is a point in a graph. And what we're trying to do is segment the graph, divide the graph into pieces that have the same label. And what we're trying to do, so it's a clustering problem, so most of you will be familiar with that. And what we would like to do with this clustering is violate as few as positive constraints as possible or as few negative constraints as possible. So if we phrase it as finding the cut in the graph with violating as few positive constraints as possible, this is the minimal cut graph. And we know that this problem can be solved relatively easy in polynomial time. If we are defining this problem with negative constraint, we have to find the cut that violate as few negative constraints as possible. This would be the maximum cut. We want to violate as many constraints as we can. Okay? The maximum cut is NP hard problem. So there is a very big difference between these 2 constraints. One is easy.
Can you give us intuition? Why this is hard?
The transitivity is the intuition. It's really all falls on transitivity. And if you want to think about it like graph coloring, if you tell you the 2 countries on a map have to have the same color, it's easy. You just give them the same colors. But if I tell you every 2 neighboring countries have to have different colors, you have a lot of possibilities to consider and become exponential. If you look at it as information, if you measure the information that each of these constraints is giving you, and for the same reason, if you're comparing, again, this is in this analogy you may want to think of it as coloring, and how many clustering on the graph would be consistent with your constraints. if you're given a positive constraint, you reduce the number of clustering by a large amount. If you're given a negative constraint, you're not. You're reducing it by much less. And this is really what information measures. So you can do it formally, and you can compare, and you get that this kind of results that are listed here, and it really doesn't matter, but the specific details. What matters is that the amount of information that each negative constraint gives you is much, much smaller than the amount that the positive constraint. And again, the transitivity is the issue here. Okay, so they're very different from each other, and what I'm going to talk about, really the rest of the talk, is first of all, the algorithmic part will be how do we use these kind of constraints for learning, for obtaining classifiers. In particular, the problem that we focused on is the problem of learning similarity function. We're learning a distance function between pairs using equivalence constraints. And through the years, we actually developed a number of them. I'll briefly say something about two of the simplest and more complex, the most complex one. And the application would be mostly retrieval, and I'll show you some example, image, and other. There is a group these days in Google here in Israel, and actually also in California, that's focusing on learning distance function for retrieval. So this is actually a problem of interest in the machine learning and industry right now. The cognitive correlate, which I hope to spend most of the time in this talk, because it's a little more relevant, I think, to this audience, is how do we see this difference between positive and negative equivalence constraint in human cognition? So we did a series of experiments. First of all, after observing the differences, we did some experiment asking whether people use this constraint differently. So that would be probably what I'll have time to talk about. We'll see that adults' categorization is very different, has some very different properties. And we extended this to developmental studies showing that the time of the age at which children start to use the two different constraints is different. We see evidence in fMRI studies that the brain areas that are involved in processing these two types of constraints might be different, or at least there is a difference, so difference we can report. Okay? So there is a very interesting difference here in also the way people are using this. But first, the simpler case, machine learning is always simpler. So what is the algorithmic problem we're trying to solve? We're trying to learn a distance function. So this is our problem. We're given a bunch of points, data points. This is our sample. We're given a bunch of relations. Red would signify, in the rest of the talk, always red signifies the negative constraints and blue or green the positive constraints. So these 2 points you would like them to be together, to be close to each other. These ones you'd like them to be far. And your problem is to come up with a single function on pairs of points that tells you the distance between them, or similarity, where 0 in our case, 0 would be very similar, 1 would be different. So the first thing we did was the RCA algorithm. Really, this algorithm, what it's trying to do is come up with a linear similarity function, or Mahalanobis function. This is really the Euclidean distance. The distance between 2 points, x1 and x2, is almost the Euclidean distance, but it's weighted here by this matrix B. That's what makes it Mahalanobis rather than Euclidean. Okay? And our task is to learn the best matrix B such that the distance between points in this learned matrix, points that have positive equivalence constraint, the distance will be small, and points that have negative equivalence constraint, the distance will be large. Okay? So this is the problem we set out to solve. We solve it. It's actually fairly simple. And we come up with this expression down here. And the only reason this would be the only equation, or maybe there would be one other equation, the only reason I'm showing it is that it will look familiar to some of you. This is related to it's really the average empirical covariance matrix. It's very, very simple to calculate. It's a closed form solution. And what I would like to draw your attention that this is very nice, but all we did here is use positive constraints. So if all we are doing is using positive constraint, we want a linear function, a linear similarity, we can compute it in a closed form and then use it.
And the type hat J is mean?
So I didn't say what NJ was, but in this case, NJ is, you can think of it as the equivalence set. It's the number since positive constraints has closures, transitive closures. So each they do the transitive closure. You get groups. We call them chunklets, and these are groups that have the same label. And each one of the arcade group with the same label, and each group has NJ elements. It can be more than 2 because of this transitive closure. Okay, so that's the missing notations here. Already this similarity function has nice properties. So this is the first experiment we did. It's with the Yale B dataset collected in Columbia. And this dataset of faces it's been around for a long time. What's interesting about it is that the images differ in just one aspect, which is lighting. So we have a bunch of faces of quite 20-30 individuals, and we have quite a few images of the same individual with the same posture, the same viewpoint, the same expression, because these pictures were taken about 20 or 30 pictures all within 2 seconds, but different illumination. Okay, so the reason it's interesting is that if you can look at it, remember we are working with pixel values. The pixel values of these pictures are very, very different. There's a lot of white here, there's a lot of dark here. And that's why it was perceived as a difficult problem. The face is the same, the pixel values appear to be very different. So what the algorithm gets is a bunch of these things. We tell it, okay, these are all pictures of the same person. And we have a few of those, about, say, 10 individuals. And we ask it to learn a distance function. And we can view this distance function as a projection back into image space. This is what happens here. So what you can see, what this algorithm actually did, it found edges. And we know that edges, one of the motivations for edges was that they're invariant to illumination change. They remain edges, even if you change illumination quite a bit. I'm not talking about shadow edges. So this is really what this algorithm found. The distance function is really equivalent, or the Mahalanobis matrix is equivalent to projecting the faces into this space where and essentially to extracting edges. Okay, so this is the train. Now comes a new test. We use the same distance that we have learned to find the distance between these faces. They all look the same in this space, and indeed the algorithm finds that they are the same. So on this database, the LB database, it performs very well. But we did want to use a positive and negative constraint, and this has been a very active area of research in machine learning in the last 10 years. By now, tens of papers about it. Our own contribution is this algorithm where we use for the use of positive and negative constraint. Actually, we have another one as well. But this is let's say, the most powerful, the most non-parametric, the heaviest, and the one we understand the least, because it's just gradient descent-like algorithm. So it's an algorithm that's trying to learn similarity using positive and negative equivalence constraint. And the main framework we use is boosting. Boosting, for those who don't know, it's equivalent to gradient descent in some way. So it's an algorithm that non-parametrically try to improve the estimate. This is the outline of the algorithm. So we start with a bunch of constraints. We have an estimate. We compute how good the estimate is. We ask ourselves, well, which constraints the estimated similarity satisfies, which it doesn't satisfy. This is the boosting part, because those constraints that are not satisfied, what we're going to do is increase their weights and run the whole thing over and over again and try to get improvement. Okay, so it's a iterative gradient descent-like algorithm. The one part I want to talk about is this one, because this is again where the positive and negative constraints get into the story. So what are we doing here? Here we're using constraints. There is a sample. There are constraints between the sample red and blue, and we're trying to find a Gaussian GML model, Gaussian mixture model. So what is a Gaussian mixture model? You have a bunch, most of you already know, but let's repeat it. A Gaussian mixture model, we try to model a bunch of distribution of points with a mixture of Gaussians. And the standard way to do it is with the EM algorithm. This is our problem, only there is a little twist. It's not just a sample of points. It's a sample of points with some constraint on them. So there is a negative constraint in red and a positive constraint in blue. So what we have to do to solve it is just modify the EM algorithm so that it can handle constraints. This is what we did, and the EM algorithm is, like its name says, it has two steps, E and M, the expectation and maximization. The only modification that we have to do is when we do expectation over when we average over all the possible solution, we want to average only over the viable solution, the one that satisfies the constraints. And that's really the only difference. But like Ran was saying, again, there's a lot of formulation there, so somebody has to do it. Noam Shintal, the student who worked on it, did it, and came up with an expression. Most interesting is this, there's maybe interesting part for our discussion is how do we put this constraint into the EM algorithm. And the way we do it is by a Markov network. And what's important for our discussion is that it's very easy to put the positive constraint, again, because they're transitive. We're just telling ourselves samples that have a positive constraint between them have to be in the same Gaussian source. That's it. It's very simple. But samples that have a negative constraint between them have to be in two different sources. That's not transitive anymore, so it's more complicated. And for that, in order to incorporate, we have to have hidden variables, and that makes the whole inference much more complicated. So that's the complicated part. Actually, we don't have a solution for that that's efficient. So we can't handle any number of negative constraints. We have all kinds of approximations.
Do you also work with partial positive, like probabilistic positive constraints?
Actually, probabilistic positive constraint would give us would be more difficult for us to handle because we lose the transitivity. Okay, so that's
everything would then be hard.
Yeah. So then everything is hard, right? We did think of doing it, but that's put all the constraints have to be put in the same. So what did we do with this algorithm? What the application? And the first thing we did is image retrieval. That was our motivation. We want to, so like Google is trying to do these days. You have an image. This is a let's say. In the image retrieval application, you have a query image, and you want to retrieve image like it. Google today doesn't really know how to do it based on images. They do it based on keywords and text, and it would be nice if you could do it based on images. So that's one of the motivation. Here are the pictures. It would be nice if we could retrieve to this query those two. So we had this data set that we took, the database that we actually collected of a number of pictures of animals. We used a representation that basically captured the color and the texture. It doesn't really matter right now, but the only information, what's important for us is that the only information that we are using is text, is color, and a little bit of texture. It actually also captured the granularity of the color. It's almost color histograms, but a little more than that, not much more. And we learned this distance function, this kernel boost and this boost, and then we apply it to images we have never seen in the training set. So this is a good example. What we see here is on the left is the query. On the right are the answers, the results that our system gives us. And if we just use the Euclidean distance, no learning, and like I said, the representation is mostly based on color, what it gives is mostly pictures with a lot of blue. That's what it gives. So we get a lot of fish. But our distance function, we actually had example, not this dog, but these dogs. We had them in our data set. We were told that they are from the same class. And somehow this is good enough so that we return only dogs. So these are the closest distances in the image in our database. These are the closest images to the query.
Which negative constraints did you use? If you have a database which has several classes, then you got all the positive negatives.
We didn't use, we used in this example we had a train and test set, and we could use all the negative constraints, but we didn't because of computational issues. But
how many did you use?
Order of magnitude of n rather than n squared. Okay. So if n is the number of pictures, n squared is the number of constraints, we could only handle O of n. This is another example. Again, the query, the results. It's still, we're doing much better than Euclidean distance. Euclidean here because shows what happens when there is no training. No training, we get things that have similar color, similar texture. With training, we get pretty much, we get a lot of monkeys, but we also get this thing that's supposed to be, it's kind of ponies. So that's not great, and we can also get things that are, in this case, the query is a polar tiger, I think, and it thinks it's monkeys, so we get back only monkeys. So that's the main application. The other thing that's another application, and that will conclude my algorithmic part, the other application is, and one of the motivation for interest in similarity in distance function, that this is a good way of transferring knowledge to new classes, new categories that we've never seen before. If we have a good distance, a good similarity between known categories, it may help us identify or do something useful, retrieve similar image to a category we've never seen before. So we did this experiment that's trying to find out whether we did get, whether we were getting any help in any improvement in performance in transfer. And our transfer is the following. So our database is the MNIST database in letters, images of letters. Okay, so this is a computer vision application, pictures of letters and digits. Sorry, and we choose 4 digits. 2 of them we call large sample, meaning that there is about 100 training examples for each digit, and 2 come from the small sample, meaning there is a small sample for each digit, 3 or 4. This is too small in order to learn a good classifier. Just 3 examples in this case is not enough. So our question was whether the fact that we have already images, digits with a lot of training data will help us in this task. So we trained a bunch of classifiers. What we call small versus small is a classifier between those 2 digits, those that have small sample. Small versus large, meaning a classifier between a digit with a small sample and a digit with a large sample, and large versus large, trying to classify that distinguish these 2 digits. Okay, and what's important here in the slides is to see, these are the 3 conditions. We have our 5 results here. These are all classification results with a support vector machine. The only difference is the kernel. In these 2 cases, our kernel, the one we learned. Here, standard kernels, the last 3, standard kernels that are not being learned. And in the literature, it has been known for a long time that the polynomial with 5 degree works very well. So this is supposed to be a winner. And what we see is that indeed it's a linear with large versus large, meaning when there is enough training data, it's the winner. But when the training sample is small, 3, 4 pictures, it's not doing very well. There is no result, and the best performances are algorithms. So the bottom line is that learning the distance function does help us transfer information from digits with large sample to digits with small sample. So that's encouraging.
What is the name?
Support vector machine is a linear kernel. Linear.
So
rather basis function.
It's also.
Yeah, with small sample, linear is always doing better than other things because it has the smallest number of parameters to fit. Right? But it's still doing much less. You see a big difference. That's a very big difference in this case. So, yeah, as expected, it's doing better than polynomial, better than the RBF. Actually, no, it's not doing better than the RBF in this second one. Okay, so this was the algorithm work, and like I was trying to emphasize, there is a tension between learning similarity with positive constraint, which is easy, or with positive and negative, which is using more information, but it's harder because those negative constraints are really making the problem a lot more difficult. And the rest of the talk, which probably about 15 minutes, the rest of the time I'm going to describe our studies of human cognition, human perception, and how we try to answer the question whether humans use positive and negative constraints differently. So that was the research question. What we did is design an experimental paradigm where we are comparing performance in a categorization task when the training data came in with either positive equivalence constraint or negative equivalence constraint. Okay, so that's how we confront them. So now, in the next few minutes, I'll describe the experimental paradigm. Thanks. These are stimuli. That's Ruby Hammer is the one who is responsible for them. He designed this wonderful artificial world of aliens coming from different tribes. So each alien is characterized by 5 features. The features are listed here. I know the contrast is terrible, but I had this. There was a reason for that. I'll read it all out. So there are 5 features. The eye color. The eye color, they can be one of 2 values. So there are 5 features. Each one has binary values. So eye colors can be red or blue in this case. Skin color can be yellow or pink. Ear shape, as you can see. Nose shape can be, again, as you can see. And chin. As an interesting part, you may notice that the chin is much less salient than the others, and this was one of the actually motivation of this study, is to see how features that have less perceptual saliency would be compared to features that have more perceptual saliency, but this actually never came about in the study. So these are the 5 features.
Were these dimensions given explicitly to subjects?
No. And not at this point. There was a phase where they were. So in this experiment we had 3 conditions. In the first one, well, let's say experiment 1, the first condition, the constraints were selected randomly. So we have this bunch of 5 features, so the number of possible possibilities or number of possible aliens is 2 to the 5th, 32. And we were selected pairs randomly and show them to the subject or the 2 participants, telling him whether they come from the same or from different tribes. Okay, so in the first condition, in the positive equivalence constraint, we selected randomly pairs that come from the same tribes. In the negative equivalence constraint, we selected randomly pairs that come from different tribes, and then there was a control where no supervision was given. So here's an example of what happened in the randomly selected positive equivalence constraint. Say you selected these pairs, so the subjects look at them and tell himself that the eye color is different. What else? The nose is different, but everything else is the same. So the subjects were ICNC students, to the most part they're fairly intelligent. So they would conclude from that probably the eye color and the skin and the nose shape are not a determining factor of the tribe membership. So you can be a member of the same tribe even if you have the same different eyes or different nose. Next, he'd get usually 2 or 3 examples. Here is another pair. Here the eye color is different, the chin is different. I think that's differing features here. So the subject would conclude that the chin is also probably not important or does not tell which tribe you belong to. Finally, the third one, actually you don't learn anything new here because you already knew that the eye don't matter, the nose doesn't matter, and the chin doesn't matter. Now the task is on the board, on the screen, appear a picture. You tell me this is a chief of a new tribe, and of one of the tribes, sorry, and you have to drag all the members of that tribe. So you have to, based on that training, to conclude which are the features that determine whether you belong to the tribe, and then conclude, and then from that deduce which individuals belong to the tribe of this chief. So that's a positive equivalence constraint. You hopefully concluded that what matters is the ear shape and the skin color. At most. These are the only things that could be important to tribe membership. This is a negative, random negative equivalence constraint. So again, you choose a pair randomly. What you can conclude from that is that there's lots of things distinguishing between these 2 guys, the color of the eyes, the color of the skin. So it's really hard to tell what is the thing that makes them come from different tribes. Is it the color of the eyes or the color of the skin? Or I think that's the only differences there. Same here. Here you notice the different color of the skin, different color of the eyes. In this case, the ear is different. but you keep seeing those pairs, and it's actually hard for you to conclude what is the important features that tell you which are the features that you should use to determine whether they come from the same tribe or not. So it's hard to conclude that, but people have to do it, and that's what they do in this condition. The third condition, or the third case, is where they're not giving any constraints. They have to just do their best, based on perceptual similarity or whatever other source they might be using. So we are comparing people performance in how well they match people to chief, tribe members to chief, based after the training phase. And this is a kind of rock diagram. What you should remember is that being up here is good. That's the best you can do. And down here is bad. Okay, so the more you lean up and left, the better the performance is. Right and down is the worst performance.
So in the no constraint, what they're supposed to do, and what's the target? How do you define correct and incorrect?
So we have certain features that are determined in this case. Let's look at this example.
But you have enough examples shown to the subject that it is uniquely determined?
Yeah. So the subject seen enough examples to know that ear shape and skin color are important. And now he should match all the individuals in this that have the same ear shape and the same and are
but that's true also of the negative.
It's not true of the negative. Well, it's true also of the negative. We have a ground truth, but it's harder for people to conclude it.
I know, but there is a unique solution based on the examples that they've seen. There's enough information in the examples that they've seen.
In this case, there isn't. In the next example.
So this is what one is.
Yeah. That's why here the result will not be that surprising, but in the next condition, we actually control the amount of information. So here, like I said, let's see, there's this nice question mark here. The subject doesn't get enough information necessarily to know which are the features. And he doesn't get enough information, so not surprisingly, he's doing worse. Okay, so that's what we expected. How do we see that he's doing more? The blue, the positive, are doing closer to the upper left corner than the red. And this, we should see better. This is the mean result. So the blue, the positive constraint, are closer to the good side than the red. And here it's easier to see. These are the performance, no supervision, negative constraint, positive constraint. Negative constraint almost do the same as no supervision. They really didn't learn very much. Positive constraint, they're doing much better. Okay, but this is not surprising because they have different amount of information. So in the second condition, this is where it gets interesting. We actually control the amount of information. We give them positive constraint, negative constraint that have exactly the same amount of information, and it's very simple to derive. They only had one feature that differed. And if it's positive constraint, you know that the feature tells you that if you know that two individuals come from the same tribe but they have different eye color, you know that eye color is not important for tribe membership. If two comes from different tribes and they have different eye color, and that's the only difference, then you know that what distinguishes people from different tribes is the eye color. So here, in this condition, they have the same amount of information. It was almost as easy to use. In fact, the negative was easier to use. And now we would like to see whether people can use it. I'll skip the example, but so this is the result we are getting. And now we see that there is a great overlap between the blue points and the red points. They look similar. They are actually similar. If we look at the average, we see that they're roughly in the same place, roughly the same distance from the good corner. But there is a difference. There is a difference in bias that will actually become important. For now, it's not important. The same performance. You look at the performance, positive, negative are the same more or less. The results are much better than no supervision. People can use positive and negative equivalence constraint. If we compare it to what we've seen before, so the positive actually hasn't improved very much. The negative, we used to be here, we went from this point up to here, much closer to the good corner, and this is the random. Okay? So the positive didn't improve much, the negative improved quite a bit. Okay, so we see here that when we give them high informative constraint, people can use them. And they can use them almost as efficiently. So the last question we asked, well, like Chaim was asking me before, can they do this task? Well, they can do the task. Actually, we give them all the information they need.
It's 5 minutes? Okay.
We give them all the information they need. But they're not doing perfectly. Why is that? Well, what we're going to do now is tell them what to do.
Both for positive and negative.
Both positive and negative. We're going to give them instructions. In the last condition, we give them instructions exactly what to do so that they can perform this task perfectly. We tell them how many features there are, and we tell them what kind of relations. Back to your old question. And what's interesting now is, actually, I'll skip this. What's interesting now is that the negative, you see the red points got almost all the way to the top. The blue haven't. If we compare to where we've been before, so negative constraints are doing better than positive, and negative now are better than positive, and if you compare to where we've been before, the positive improved a little bit, the negative haven't. So what are we seeing here is actually that people with positive constraint resist instructions. They don't listen to what you tell them, they don't improve their performance. With the negatives, they do. This is the summary. The next slide would summarize the result. So this is what we see with positive constraint. They start, we sample those constraints randomly, they do fairly well, but not perfect. We give them high informative, they don't really improve significantly. We give them instructions what to do, they don't improve. With the negative constraint, they start off doing very poorly with random constraint. When we give them a informative constraint, they actually have two kinds of population. There's some who don't improve and some who improve tremendously. When we give them instructions, they all do very well. And all that led us to conclude that possibly hypothesize that the use of positive equivalence constraint is based on some perceptual low-level mechanism. That's why when we give cognitive instruction, a set of rules how to use this data and improve, people actually don't use it. While with negative equivalence constraint, they might be using something that's more cognitive, more rule-based, and therefore, when you give them instructions, they actually can use this instruction and get almost perfect. And, okay, so that leads us to we did some experiment on children. What really matters is that children can use, again, red is negative, green is positive. Children are doing much better with negative at the age of 10, but at the age of 6 they're not. With positive there is no age difference. So children learn to use the negative constraint much later on. We did fMRI studies and find area in the brain where where the condition of negative constraint are activated, not in the condition of positive constraint. And again, these areas, very interestingly, are associated with reasoning, with rule-based categorization. So again, they support the hypothesis that there is something more perceptual with positive constraint and more rule-based, more cognitive, more rule-based in negative constraint. So to summarize, I talked about, first of all, I talked about pairwise comparison as a important source of information. And I give you some motivation that it can come as an unsupervised, it can come for free in some cases. So it's interesting. We designed some algorithms that use these kind of constraints to learn similarity function with an application to retrieval, basically. And we studied the use of this constraint in human cognition, seeing that indeed people also use positive and difference constraint differently, different characteristics. The ability to use this constraint develop at a different age, and also possibly different areas of the brain are involved in processing this information.
And have they come up?
You mentioned you need to have more negative constraints and positive constraints, and even in the informative case.
So in the informative constraint, we didn't. It actually was controlled in such a way that the information was identical in both cases, and each constraint contributed exactly the same amount. 2 positive constraints were equivalent to 2 negative, on the average, because we had 5 features, but it was controlled.
just a clarification question. So in the experiments, the subjects saw the 32 creatures with some relations, or they just saw 3 pairs?
In the original experiments, they saw all 32 and some relations. In the later 2 experiments, they only saw pairs. In the developmental, but the ones I didn't talk about as mentioned.